The year was 1878, and the wind howled a lonely tune across the vast expanse of Wyoming. Silas Cooper, a man weathered by more than just the elements, stood on the porch of his isolated cabin, watching the storm gather. The sky, a bruised purple and grey, was a mirror of his own soul, heavy, turbulent, and filled with the ghosts of a war he could never truly leave behind. The cabin was a simple structure, a testament to his desire for a life free of complications and people. It was a place where he could exist, not live, and where the only company was the deafening silence of the wilderness. Silas had come to this corner of the world to escape. The Civil War had taken everything from him, his innocence, his friends, and a piece of his humanity he was sure he would never reclaim. He was an ex-Union soldier, but the uniform had long since been replaced by frayed denim and a worn leather vest. His hands, once steady with a rifle, were now calloused from chopping wood and mending fences. The deep scars on his knuckles and the haunted look in his eyes told a story of battles that were not just fought on a battlefield, but in the depths of his memory. He found a kind of solace in the relentless routine of his life, the chopping of wood, the tending of his small garden, the daily checks on his horses. It was a life of simple, repetitive tasks that required no thought, no emotion, just physical endurance. The storm broke with a fury that rattled the tin roof of his cabin. Rain came down in sheets, blurring the line between the sky and the earth. Thunder boomed, a sound that always took him back to the roar of cannons, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, blinding flashes. Silas retreated inside, the familiar scent of pine and old leather wrapping around him. He lit a single oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was about to pour himself a cup of whiskey when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a splinter of glass. It was a cry for help. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, a figment of his imagination. But then he heard it again, this time clearer, more desperate. It was coming from the direction of the river, a body of water that swelled into a dangerous torrent during storms like this. His first instinct was to ignore it, to stay inside, safe and dry. The world was full of trouble, and he had learned the hard way that getting involved only led to more pain. He had promised himself he would never again put himself in harm's way for another soul. But the cry was raw, human, and full of a terror he understood all too well. He grabbed his oilskin coat and a coil of rope. The wind fought him as he stepped outside, pushing him back. But the cries pulled him forward. He stumbled through the mud, the rain plastering his hair to his head and chilling him to the bone. The river was a raging monster, a churning brown chaos of water, branches, and debris. The noise was deafening, the roar of the water swallowing all other sounds. He scanned the angry current, his eyes straining in the gloom, and then he saw her, a flash of color. A figure clinging to a half-submerged log. It was a woman. She was a native, her dark hair a stark contrast to the pale log she held onto. She was being tossed and battered by the current, her grip slipping. She was tall, built with a kind of strength that was surprising, but the river was stronger. Her cries were weaker now, almost lost to the storm. Silas didn't think. The soldier in him, the part he thought was dead, took over. He anchored the rope around the thick trunk of a fallen cottonwood tree, and with a deep breath, he stepped into the churning water. The cold was a shock, a physical blow that stole his breath. The current fought him, pulling at his legs, trying to drag him under. He battled his way closer, the rope a lifeline in the chaotic water. He could see her face now, a mask of fear and exhaustion. Her large, dark eyes met his, and he saw a fierce, unyielding spirit, even in the face of death. He managed to get within a few feet, close enough to throw the end of the rope to her. He yelled over the storm, his voice hoarse, "Grab it! Grab the rope!" She didn't hesitate. With a final surge of strength, she let go of the log and lunged for the rope. Her fingers closed around it, and Silas felt the jolt of her weight. He pulled, his muscles screaming in protest. The river was relentless, but he held his ground, his feet digging into the muddy bottom. Slowly, inch by inch, he pulled her towards him, towards the safety of the bank. She was exhausted, her body limp, but she held on. When he finally dragged her onto the muddy bank, she collapsed, shivering violently. He pulled her away from the water's edge, onto the relative safety of the wet grass. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her, her body marked with scrapes and bruises. He knelt beside her, his own chest heaving, and checked for a pulse. It was weak, but there. He spoke, his voice gentle. "You're safe now. You're safe." She didn't respond, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He knew he couldn't leave her there. The storm was only getting worse, and she would succumb to the cold. He had to get her back to his cabin. He looked at her, at the proud sculpted lines of her face, the evidence of a strength he knew she possessed even in her unconscious state. She was not a small woman. She was tall with a powerful build, and carrying her would be a challenge. But he had no other choice. With a sigh, he lifted her into his arms. The weight was significant, but he had carried heavier burdens during the war. He held her close, her body cold against his, and began the slow, difficult walk back to the meager shelter he called home. He had rescued her, but he knew this was just the beginning. The world had just intruded on his isolated existence, and he had a feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The journey back to the cabin was a trial of will against the storm. The wind howled like a living creature, and the rain came down with an aggressive intensity that seemed to want to strip the flesh from his bones. Silas kept his head down, his focus fixed on the faint, flickering light of his oil lamp, visible through the cabin's window. The woman in his arms was a dead weight, her body heavy with exhaustion and the chill of the river. He could feel her shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that told him she was close to hypothermia. He tightened his grip, holding her closer, sharing what little body heat he had. When he finally reached the porch, he fumbled with the latch, the cold making his fingers clumsy. He kicked the door open and half stumbled inside, the storm's fury following him for a moment, before he slammed the door shut. The sudden silence was a shock, broken only by his own heavy breathing and the steady drip of water from his clothes onto the wooden floor. He carried her to his bunk, a simple cot covered with a thick buffalo hide, and gently laid her down. He worked quickly, his movements precise and practiced. He pulled off her wet clothing, his hands respectful, focused only on the task of getting her dry and warm. Underneath her deerskin tunic, he saw the faint, intricate beadwork of her tribe on her moccasins and the deep red of a scrape on her forehead. He wrapped her in the dry buffalo hide, pulling it tight around her shoulders. Her shivering began to subside, but she remained unconscious, her breathing still shallow. The fire in the hearth had died down to a few embers. Silas knelt, grabbing a handful of kindling and a log from the woodpile. He rebuilt the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. The first few sparks caught, and a small, hopeful flame danced in the hearth. He fed it more wood, watching as the warmth began to spread through the small cabin, pushing back the cold and the darkness. The cabin filled with the comforting smells of wood smoke and pine. He sat on a stool across from the bunk, watching her. In the soft light of the oil lamp and the fire, he could see her more clearly. She was indeed tall, even in a lying position, and her frame was powerful, her shoulders broad and her arms muscular. Her face, a study in quiet strength, was high cheekboned, with a proud, straight nose. Her hair, long and black, was fanned out on the pillow. He felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. He had rescued an Apache woman. The tension between his people and hers was a constant simmering conflict, a history of raids, massacres, and broken treaties. Yet here she was, under his roof, at his mercy. He had no idea what to do. He couldn't turn her away in her condition. He was a man of the land, a man who understood the unwritten code of survival. You helped those in need, regardless of who they were. It was a rule as old as the mountains themselves. He also knew the risk he was taking. If her tribe found out she was with a white man, even a man who had saved her life, there could be trouble. He was on their land, in their territory. The thought sent a jolt of unease through him, but he pushed it down. He would deal with that when the time came. For now, he just had to focus on getting her well. He walked over to his small kitchen area and heated some water in a tin kettle. He made a weak tea from dried herbs he had foraged, hoping it would help warm her from the inside out. He knelt beside the bunk again, carefully lifting her head and holding the tin cup to her lips. She didn't respond at first, but then, with a soft sigh, she swallowed a little. He continued, his movements slow and gentle, until she had finished the cup. Her breathing became more regular, her cheeks regaining a touch of color. Silas sat back on the stool, the firelight illuminating the lines on his face. He found himself thinking about her, a person he knew nothing about. Who was she? What was her story? Was she alone, or were others looking for her? The questions swirled in his mind, pulling him out of his solitude, forcing him to think about a world beyond his small patch of land. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection to another human being, however fleeting. Hours passed. The storm outside began to lose its ferocity, the wind dying down to a whisper. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and the soft, even breathing of the woman on his bunk. Silas, exhausted but unable to sleep, found himself watching her, a guardian in the quiet dark. He was a man who had lived for years with no one to care for but himself. He had built walls of solitude around his heart, and he was surprised to find them beginning to crumble. Her presence, a silent, powerful force, was a stark contrast to his lonely existence. He didn't know what the morning would bring. He didn't know if her people would come for her or if they would see him as a threat. But for tonight, he had done what was right. He had saved a life. And in the silent, flickering light of the fire, that was enough. The first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's small window, painting the room in soft shades of grey and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent, save for the drip of water from the eaves. Silas, who had dozed off in his chair, woke with a jolt. His senses, honed by years of living on the edge, were immediately on high alert. He heard a sound from the bunk, the soft rustle of movement. He looked over. The woman was awake. She was sitting up, the buffalo hide still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes, as dark and deep as the river she had almost drowned in, were fixed on him. They held a mix of caution, fear, and a fierce intelligence. She didn't say a word, just watched him, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of their shared history. Silas stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, a gesture he had learned from traders and trappers. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're safe. The storm passed." She didn't respond, her gaze unwavering. He noticed the dried blood on her forehead and the dark bruises on her arms. He pointed to the kettle on the hearth. "I have warm water and some tea. You must be cold." She finally spoke. Her voice was surprisingly deep, with a low, melodic quality. "Who are you?" she asked in broken but understandable English. Her accent was thick, the words careful. "My name is Silas Cooper," he said. He gestured to the cabin. "This is my place." She looked around the small space, taking in the simple furniture, the rifle on the wall, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. Her eyes lingered on his face, studying the lines etched by time and a different kind of war. "You saved me from the river," she stated, not a question. "Yes," he replied. "The current was too strong. You were drowning." She nodded slowly, a small flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "My name is Nita." She said it with a sense of pride, a defiance that told him she was more than just a survivor. She was a warrior. Nita carefully unwrapped the buffalo hide and stood. He had been right. She was a tall woman, almost as tall as he was, with a powerful, athletic build. Her clothes, which Silas had hung near the fire to dry, were still damp. He pointed to them. "They are almost dry. You can put them on." She walked over and picked up her tunic. She didn't look at him, her back to him as she dressed, a small private moment of dignity. He respected it, turning away and giving her space. When she was finished, she turned to face him again. The deerskin tunic was still damp, but it was better than nothing. She looked more like herself now, more confident, less vulnerable. "Why?" she asked, her eyes searching his. The question was simple, but it carried a lot of weight. "Why did you save me?" Silas shrugged, a small, weary gesture. "It was the right thing to do," he said. The river was going to take you. She studied him for a long moment, a suspicion in her gaze that was a reflection of the world they lived in. She was a member of the Apache, a tribe whose land was being taken, whose people were being hunted. She knew that trust was a luxury, a dangerous one. "You do not seem like a man who does the right thing without a reason," she said. His past flashed before his eyes. The battles, the choices he had made, the men he had killed, the men he had failed to save. He knew she was right. His motives were not always pure. But this time, they were. "I'm a man who's seen enough death," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't need to see another one." She seemed to accept his answer, or at least she didn't press the issue. She walked over to the table where he had placed a bowl of fresh fruit, wild berries he had picked the day before, and a slice of hard bread. She picked up a handful of berries and ate them slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "My father will be looking for me," she said, the words a quiet warning. "He is Cochise, the leader of our people." Silas felt a jolt of recognition and fear. Cochise. The name was legendary, a symbol of defiance and a formidable warrior. The stories told of his strategic brilliance and his unwavering loyalty to his people. Silas had heard the whispers from settlers and soldiers alike. This woman was the daughter of a legend. The weight of his actions suddenly felt heavier. He had rescued a woman whose father could see him as a friend or an enemy. He had no way of knowing which. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I understand," he said simply. "I will not stop you from leaving. When you are strong enough, you can go." She finished the berries and looked at him. "I am strong enough now," she said. But she made no move to leave. She seemed to be waiting, assessing him, deciding what to do next. The air was thick with the unspoken tension of their different worlds, two opposing forces brought together by the random, violent act of nature. He didn't know it then, but the storm that had brought them together was far from over. It had just moved from the river to the small wooden cabin. The morning passed in a quiet that was both a relief and a source of tension. Nita remained in the cabin, a silent, watchful presence. She moved with an innate grace, her movements fluid and purposeful. She didn't speak much, but her eyes missed nothing. She noticed the way Silas tended to his small vegetable patch, the careful way he sharpened his axe, and the deep, permanent sadness that seemed to live in his eyes. He in turn watched her. He saw the way she ran her fingers over the intricately carved designs on her bow, the way her gaze often drifted to the horizon, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. They communicated with gestures and a few strained words. Silas offered her a bowl of stew he had made from dried venison and vegetables. She took it without a word, her expression unreadable. She sat on the floor near the hearth, eating slowly and methodically. Silas ate his own meal in silence, the quiet between them filled with the ghosts of their respective pasts. He was a veteran of a war that had torn his country apart. She was the daughter of a chief fighting to keep his people and their land from being torn apart. They were two sides of the same coin, both scarred by conflict and loss. He found himself thinking about the war again. He remembered the mud and the blood, the endless marches, the faces of men he had fought beside, now just names on a list. He remembered the moment he had decided to leave it all behind, to trade the chaos of battle for the solitude of the wilderness. He had thought that by running away he could escape the memories, but he had learned that memories were like shadows. They followed you no matter how far you ran. Nita, too, was lost in thought. She was thinking of her father, of the constant struggle to protect their people, of the raids and the retaliations. She had been on a scouting mission when the storm had hit, a dangerous task even in good weather. She had been swept from her horse, a powerful mare that had lost its footing in the rising waters of a flash flood. She was a strong swimmer, but the river had been a monster. She had felt the icy grip of death, the panic, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. And then there was Silas, the white man who had reached into the chaos and pulled her out. She had been taught from a young age to distrust white men. They were the ones who had brought disease, who had stolen their land, who had broken every promise they had ever made. And yet, this one had saved her life. He was different. He didn't look at her with contempt or fear. He looked at her with a quiet, weary sadness that she recognized as a kinship of soul. He was a man who had seen too much, just as she had. She could sense the grief in him, a deep well of unspoken pain. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Silas broke the silence. "You said your father would be looking for you," he said. "Are you sure you want to wait here?" Nita looked up from the fire. Her expression was thoughtful. "He will know where I am. The spirits will tell him. I must wait for him." Silas felt a shiver of unease. "Spirits," she smiled, a small wry curve of her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it transformed her face. "You do not believe?" she asked. "I believe in what I can see and touch," he said. "Then you do not believe in the wind," she countered, her voice soft but firm. "Or the sound of the river?" He had no answer for that. He was a man of logic and reason, a man who relied on facts and tangible things. But she was a woman of a different world, a world where the earth and the sky were alive with a power he could not comprehend. The night fell, and the moon rose, a pale white disk in the black sky. Silas and Nita sat by the fire, the flickering light playing across their faces. The silence was no longer tense. It was comfortable, a shared space of solitude. He thought of all the years he had spent alone, and how much he had yearned for this simple human connection. He had found it in the unlikeliest of places. With the daughter of a chief he was taught to fear. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if Cochise would come in peace or in war. But for tonight, there was a fragile peace between them. A silence that spoke of a shared past and an uncertain future, two souls tethered by a single desperate act of rescue. The next morning, the sun rose, a brilliant orange ball painting the sky. The world was fresh, clean, and silent. Silas was on his porch, splitting wood, the rhythm of his axe a steady beat against the morning quiet. Nita was by the river, her eyes scanning the opposite bank, a silent sentinel waiting for the inevitable. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. A sense of peace, however fragile, had settled over them. It was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Silas dropped his axe and instinctively reached for the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Nita turned, her face a mask of stone, and watched as a group of riders emerged from the trees. There were 6 of them, all mounted on powerful painted horses. They were Apache warriors, their faces streaked with paint, their bodies lean and strong. At the head of the group was a man whose presence was as commanding as a mountain. His hair was long and graying, his face lined with the wisdom of years and the harshness of a warrior's life. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a power that seemed to bore straight into Silas's soul. This was Cochise. The riders stopped a few yards from the cabin, and the silence was palpable. Silas stood his ground, the rifle in his hands, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He knew what this looked like. A white man, a rifle, and a lone Apache woman. A situation ripe for misunderstanding and violence. He held the rifle loosely, not pointed at anyone, a silent plea for peace. Cochise dismounted and walked towards his daughter. Nita met him halfway, her head held high. They spoke in their native tongue, the words a rapid flow of sound that was a mystery to Silas. He could only watch their faces, trying to read their emotions. He saw relief in Cochise's eyes, a deep, profound joy at seeing his daughter alive and well. Nita gestured to Silas, her hand moving in a smooth, elegant motion. She was telling him the story. Cochise's gaze turned to Silas, and the chief's face was unreadable. It held no anger, no gratitude, just a deep, intense study. He walked towards Silas, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. He was a formidable man, tall and broad, with a powerful, coiled energy that made him seem larger than life. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. "You are the man who saved my daughter," he said, in surprisingly good English, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Yes," Silas said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "She was in the river. I pulled her out." Cochise nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Silas's. "She tells me you brought her into your home. You gave her warmth and food." "She was cold," Silas said. "It was the right thing to do." Cochise's lips curled into a slight smile, a ghost of an expression. "My daughter tells me you said that before. I am curious. What is the right thing to do to a man who saves your daughter's life?" The question hung in the air, a loaded silence. Silas didn't know the answer. He had done what he felt was right, without thought of reward or punishment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just did it." Cochise nodded again, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked at Silas, at the scars on his knuckles, at the haunted look in his eyes. He saw not a colonist, but a man who had seen war and understood its true cost. He saw a man who had acted not out of greed or fear, but out of a simple human kindness. He turned to his men and spoke to them in Apache. The warriors dismounted, their movements fluid and silent, and began to unload goods from their horses. Silas watched, dumbfounded, as they laid a pile of things at his feet. There was a beautiful blanket, woven with intricate designs of red and black. There was a bag of dried meat and corn, enough to last him a month. There was a carved wooden pipe, a symbol of peace and respect. And finally, there was a single perfect eagle feather, a symbol of honor and courage. Cochise looked at him, his gaze firm. "These are a small payment," he said, "for what you have done for my family. You have shown us a kindness that is rare in these days. We, the Apache people, remember kindness. From this day forward, you are a friend of the Apache. My daughter Nita will teach you our ways, our language. She will be your sister, and should you ever need it, our protection is yours." Silas was speechless. He had expected a challenge, a confrontation, maybe even a threat. He had not expected a reward, a pact of friendship. He looked at the gifts, then at Nita, who was watching him with a knowing look. And then he looked at Cochise, at the powerful, proud leader who had just offered him a peace he had long believed was impossible. The weight of the moment settled on him. He had not just saved a life. He had forged a connection, a bridge between two worlds that were at war. The old life he had so carefully built, a life of isolation and solitude, was gone. A new, dangerous, and uncertain life was just beginning. The departure of Cochise and his warriors was as swift and silent as their arrival. They melted back into the trees, leaving Silas and Nita alone again, but the world was no longer the same. The air, once filled with the tension of their separate worlds, now hummed with the weight of Cochise's words. Silas stood there, the gifts at his feet, the meaning of them slowly sinking in. A peace treaty, a pact of friendship, forged not by a politician but by a father grateful for his daughter's life. Nita walked over to him, her face a mixture of pride and a gentle curiosity. She picked up the woven blanket, running her hand over its soft texture. "This is a great honor," she said, her voice soft. "My father does not give his friendship easily." Silas nodded, still in a daze. I don't know what to say." "You do not need to say anything," she said, looking him in the eyes. "You have already spoken with your actions." She picked up the eagle feather, its white shaft and dark tip, a perfect, elegant thing. "This is for your courage. It is a sacred gift." She held it out to him. He took it, the feather surprisingly light in his hand, but the meaning of it was heavy. He had never considered himself courageous. He had just done what needed to be done. But in their world, the simple act of a white man saving an Apache woman was an act of extraordinary bravery, a challenge to the deep-seated hatred and prejudice on both sides. Nita pointed to the food and the pipe. "These are for your hospitality. My people believe a kindness must be repaid in kind." She gestured to the surrounding land. "This land is a part of us. Now you are a part of it too. You are no longer just a man who lives here. You are a friend of the Apache people. Our home is your home. Our enemies are your enemies." The weight of her words was immense. He had lived for years with no one but himself. Now he had a sister and the protection of a whole tribe. He had traded his solitude for a dangerous and complex alliance. He looked at her, at this tall, strong woman who had been a stranger just 2 days ago, and a bond, born of a life-or-death moment, now seemed unbreakable. The days that followed were a testament to this new reality. Nita stayed. She had said she would, and she did. Her presence in his small cabin was a constant, gentle disruption. She taught him words in her language, words for the river, the sky, the mountains, the animals that roamed the land. He found that her language was beautiful, a fluid, melodic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. He, in turn, tried to teach her more English, but she was more interested in teaching him about her culture. She showed him how to track animals with a subtlety he had never seen, how to read the signs of the forest, the language of the birds, the whispers of the wind. He, a man who had thought he knew the wilderness, was humbled. She taught him about the spiritual connection her people had to the land, a connection that went far deeper than his own practical survivalist relationship with it. They spent hours sitting by the river, the water a peaceful silver ribbon now. He learned about her family, her dreams, and the heavy burden she felt as the daughter of a powerful chief. She learned about his past, about the war, about the grief he carried. He spoke about the horrors he had witnessed, the things that had driven him to this isolated life. She listened without judgment, her dark eyes a steady, comforting presence. He had always been a man who had to do everything himself, but now, with Nita by his side, he found himself relying on her knowledge, her strength. He had a companion, a partner. She was more than just a person he had saved. She was a bridge to a world he had once feared and hated. And in the silent, shared moments by the fire at night, he found a fragile, hesitant peace. The ghosts of his past still lingered, but they were no longer a deafening roar. They were a quiet whisper, overshadowed by the living, breathing presence of the woman who was now his sister, his link to a world he was slowly learning to understand. The alliance with Cochise brought an unexpected tranquility to Silas's life, a kind of peaceful coexistence he had never thought possible. The local settlers, a handful of ranchers and farmers scattered across the valley, knew of his isolated existence, but they were wary of him. He was the quiet, strange veteran who kept to himself. Now, with Nita's presence, the rumors began. People had seen the Apache warriors near his cabin, seen the tall, proud woman working by his side. The whispers grew, fueled by fear and ignorance. Silas, ever the loner, ignored the gossip. He had a deeper, more pressing concern. The alliance with Cochise, while a source of safety from the Apache, made him a target for others. The area was a volatile mix of homesteaders, gold prospectors, and opportunistic drifters. Some of these men were hostile to any form of peace with the natives, seeing them only as an obstacle to be removed. They were the kind of men who profited from conflict, who saw the land as a commodity to be exploited, not a home to be respected. One afternoon, while he and Nita were mending a section of fence, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was alone, a thin, wiry man on a weary horse. Silas recognized him as Jebediah, a prospector who occasionally passed through the area. Jebediah rode up to them, his eyes narrow as he took in the sight of Silas and Nita working together. His gaze was hostile, filled with a sneering contempt that was more dangerous than a direct threat. "Heard you got yourself a new friend, Cooper," Jebediah said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "An Apache, no less. What's a decent man like you doing with one of them?" Silas's hand went to the rifle he had leaned against the fence post. "She's not one of them," he said, his voice flat. "She's Nita, and she's a friend." Jebediah scoffed. "A friend? Since when do they make friends with us? I heard Cochise himself was here. Sounds to me like you've made a deal with the devil. So a traitor to your own kind." Nita, who had been listening in silence, stepped forward. Her presence was a silent rebuke, a powerful testament to her dignity and strength. "We are not devils," she said in her precise, measured English. "We are people of the earth. We are here to live in peace." Jebediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Peace. The only peace they want is our land, girl. You think I don't know what kind of deal you made with this white man? You got him under some kind of spell." He looked at Silas. "You better be careful, Cooper. They ain't to be trusted. They'll slit your throat in your sleep for a shiny rock." Silas took a step forward, his hand now on the rifle. "Get off my land, Jebediah," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't come back." Jebediah saw the look in his eyes and knew he had pushed too far. He spat on the ground, a final act of contempt, and wheeled his horse around. "You'll regret this, Cooper," he yelled as he rode away. You've made a bad enemy of your own kind." The encounter left a bitter taste in the air. Silas had dealt with this kind of prejudice before, but now it was directed at Nita, and it felt personal. He looked at her, at the proud set of her jaw. "I'm sorry," he said. "People like him. They don't understand." "I understand," she said, her voice calm. "I have heard it 1,000 times. He is a man with a small heart, filled with fear." She was right. But Silas knew that small-hearted men could do great harm. Jebediah was just one man, but he was a messenger, a harbinger of a greater conflict to come. The rumor of his alliance with Cochise would spread, and it would attract the wrong kind of attention. He had traded the isolation of a hermit for the dangerous prominence of a peacemaker. He had to be ready for the consequences. As the sun set, they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer one of peace, but one of a shared concern. Silas looked at Nita, at her calm, strong face. He had rescued her from the river, but he was beginning to realize that she was rescuing him from his own solitude, from the suffocating darkness of his past. The world outside was full of men like Jebediah, men who thrived on conflict and hatred. But inside his small cabin, a different kind of world was being built, a world of trust, understanding, and an alliance born of a simple act of human kindness. He knew now that the real battle was not against the land or the elements, but against the shadows of human prejudice and the deep-seated hatred that seemed to be a part of the world. And he knew that he and Nita together would have to face it. The rumor, like a venomous snake, slithered across the valley. It reached the ears of men who saw opportunity in conflict and a way to exploit a fragile peace. The news of Silas Cooper, the reclusive Union veteran having an Apache ally, spread far and wide. The man who carried the most dangerous form of this rumor was Jebediah, the prospector. He told his story in every saloon and trading post, embellishing it with his own fears and prejudices. He painted a picture of Silas as a traitor, a man who had sold out his own people for an unholy pact with a murderous tribe. The whispers reached a particularly malevolent man named Thaddeus Kane. Kane was a land speculator and a hired gun, a man with a cruel streak and a cold calculation in his eyes. He had his own small gang of men who did his dirty work. Kane had been trying for months to buy up a large section of land that bordered Silas's property. He knew the land was valuable, a key strategic point for future development and resource exploitation. Silas's refusal to sell was a minor annoyance, but the news of his alliance with the Apache was a major problem. Kane saw the situation not as a matter of friendship, but as a direct challenge to his authority and his plans. He saw Silas and his Apache friend as an obstacle to be removed, a symbol of a peace he had no use for. A single white man with the protection of Cochise was a dangerous precedent. One afternoon, Silas was working on his cabin roof, mending a shingle, when he saw them. Two riders, not in a rush, but moving with a deliberate, predatory pace. They were part of Kane's gang. As they rode closer, Silas climbed down, his hand automatically reaching for the rifle he kept by the cabin door. Nita, who was grinding corn by the fire pit, saw them too. She stood, her body still and alert, her hand moving to the small knife she kept tucked into her belt. The two men, big and burly with hard eyes, stopped a few feet from the cabin. The bigger one, a man with a pockmarked face and a sneer, looked at Silas. "Heard you've gone native, Cooper," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Silas didn't respond. He just held the rifle, his gaze steady. "Mr. Kane sends his regards," the man continued. "He says this alliance of yours is bad for business, bad for everyone." "I don't know who you're talking about," Silas said, his voice flat. "And I don't care. This is my home. You need to leave." The second man, a younger one with a cruel grin, dismounted and walked towards Nita. "Look at this," he said, his eyes raking over her body. "A real live squaw. She's a big one, ain't she, Jed? Strong like a man." The insult, the open mockery, was a direct challenge. Nita didn't flinch. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on the man, a silent, powerful warning. Silas took a step forward. "I said leave," he repeated, his voice now a low growl. "Both of you. Now." The younger man laughed. "Or what, Cooper? You gonna shoot us? Or is your little Apache friend gonna put a curse on us? He took another step towards Nita, his hand reaching out as if to touch her. Silas's training, the raw, violent instincts he had buried for years, surged to the surface. He raised the rifle, the action a smooth, practiced motion. The click of the hammer being pulled back was a loud, chilling sound in the afternoon air. The younger man froze, his hand in mid-air. "Get back on your horse," Silas said, his voice cold and lethal. "If you so much as touch her, or come within 100 yards of my property again, I will hunt you down, and I will not stop until you are dead." The two men looked at him, at the steely, unforgiving look in his eyes. They saw not a reclusive homesteader, but a man who had seen and done terrible things. The cold, unblinking look in his eyes was a look they knew well. It was the look of a killer, a man who had no fear of taking a life. The younger man slowly retreated, his face pale, his cruel grin gone. They mounted their horses and rode away, the silence of the afternoon once again settling over the land. Silas stood there for a long moment, the rifle still in his hands. He looked at Nita, who was watching him with a new light in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. He just nodded. He had issued a threat, a clear, dangerous warning. He knew the men would report back to Cain, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The fragile peace he had built was about to be tested. The world was coming for him, for them, and he would have to be ready to fight. The threat from Cain's men was a stark, brutal reminder that their new life was fraught with danger. The solitude Silas had once sought was now a target. The peace he had found was an illusion. The next day, Silas and Nita worked with a renewed sense of purpose, their movements focused and efficient. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. They spent the morning reinforcing the doors and windows. They cut down trees and built a small, sturdy corral for Silas's two horses, away from the prying eyes of passing riders. Nita, with her keen eye for the land, found a natural spring a short distance from the cabin, a hidden source of fresh water in case of a siege. She taught Silas how to set up snares for small game, a vital skill if they were unable to venture far from home. Their alliance, once a fragile pact, was now a solid partnership. They were two people different in every way, working together for a common goal, survival. They spoke less now, their communication becoming a non-verbal language of shared glances, nods, and the rhythm of their work. In the evening, as the stars began to pepper the dark sky, they sat by the fire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Nita looked at him, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "You are not a man who has lived a quiet life," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "You have seen war. I see it in your eyes." Silas sighed, the sound a release of a long-held breath. "The war? It was a long time ago. But some things, they never leave you. The fighting, it changes a man." "It does not change his heart," she said gently. "Your heart is good. You fight for what is right." He almost laughed. "I don't know about that," he said. "I ran away from a war. I came here to find peace." "Peace is not something you find," she said. "It is something you make, with your hands, with your heart, with your friends. My father gave you his friendship. He trusts you." The weight of her words was humbling. Cochise, a legendary chief, had put his faith in him, a broken man who had tried to escape the world. He felt a surge of loyalty, a fierce need to protect this newfound alliance. "I won't let him down," he said, his voice a low promise. "And I won't let you down. We will face this together." She nodded, a small, quiet gesture that meant everything. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls of the cabin. They sat in silence, two souls brought together by fate, now facing a new kind of battle. The battle was not for a river or a piece of land. It was for a belief, a principle. The belief that two people from different worlds could find common ground, that a new kind of community could be built, even in the most hostile of environments. The coming storm was not one of rain and wind, but one of hatred and greed. And they, a former soldier and a proud Apache woman, were ready to face it. They were ready to fight for their fragile peace, a peace that was born in the heart of a storm and a promise made in the face of death. The days that followed the men's visit were filled with a tense calm. Silas and Nita worked with a purpose, their movements now a silent ballet of preparation. They dug a trench around the cabin, a simple but effective defense that would offer cover. They set up tripwires with bells attached, a rudimentary alarm system to warn them of any approaching threats. The land, once a place of solitude, was now a chessboard of strategy, every rock and tree a potential advantage or a hidden danger. Nita's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. She found a series of game trails and watering holes that would allow them to move unseen. She taught Silas how to make traps from simple rope and sticks, a skill that would prove essential if their food supply was cut off. She also showed him how to identify edible plants and berries, a survival skill he had never needed to learn as a soldier. Silas, in turn, taught her how to handle his rifle with precision, explaining the mechanics and the importance of a steady hand and a calm mind. She was a quick study, her natural athleticism and focus making her a natural with the weapon. The tension in the air was palpable, a constant low-level thrum that frayed their nerves. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves brought them to attention. They ate their meals in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The peace they had so carefully built was now under siege, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the first blow was struck. The attack came in the dead of night. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. Silas was on watch, sitting by the hearth, the rifle in his lap. Nita was asleep on the bunk, her breathing soft and even. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. And then he heard it, the faint jingle of a bell. One of the tripwires. He was on his feet in an instant, his movements silent and swift. He gently shook Nita awake. She was up immediately, her eyes clear and alert. "They're here," he whispered. They moved to the window, peering out into the inky blackness. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear the soft, cautious approach of footsteps. The men were trying to be silent, but they were no match for Nita's finely tuned senses or Silas's battle-honed instincts. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. A moment later, a flickering light appeared from the tree line. It was a lantern held aloft by one of the men. A cruel, triumphant laugh echoed in the night, and then they heard the unmistakable sound of a match being struck. Silas's blood ran cold. They were going to burn them out. He had no time to think. He raised the rifle, aiming at the center of the lantern's glow. The shot echoed in the silence, a thunderous crack that shattered the night. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and fire, and a cry of pain followed. They heard the sound of men scattering, their footsteps clumsy and panicked in the dark. Silas didn't move. He stood at the window, the rifle still raised, his eyes scanning the darkness. The cabin was a small, fragile beacon of light in the sea of blackness. He knew the shot had only been a temporary deterrent. They would be back, and they would be back with a vengeance. Nita moved to his side, her hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were in. "You hit him," she said, her voice a low whisper. "He will not forget." "That's the point," Silas said, his voice grim. "They need to know we're ready, that we're not afraid to fight back." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds of the night. The men were gone, their footsteps fading into the distance. The only evidence of their presence was the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air and the faint sound of a man moaning in pain from the tree line. Silas and Nita didn't sleep for the rest of the night. They took turns on watch, their minds racing with what they knew was to come. The first shot had been fired. The war had come to their doorstep, a war not of nations, but of greed, prejudice, and a simple, honest desire for peace. They were alone, 2 against an unknown number of enemies. But they had something their enemies didn't. They had trust and they had each other, and in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Old West, that was a weapon more powerful than any rifle. The dawn, when it finally arrived, was a welcome relief. The sun's first rays chased away the shadows of the night, but they did little to dispel the lingering tension. The air still smelled of gunpowder, a harsh reminder of the attack. Silas and Nita spent the morning inspecting the perimeter. their eyes scanning for any signs of the intruders. They found a few discarded boot prints, a patch of crushed grass, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. The blood trail was thin, but steady. Silas's shot had found its mark, and the man would be hurting. The rest of the day was a study in patience. They knew the attack was a warning, a test of their resolve. They also knew that Cain and his men would not give up. They were men of violence and greed, and they would see this as a personal insult, a challenge to their authority. They would return, and they would be prepared. They were right. In the late afternoon, a single rider appeared on the horizon. He was not one of the men from the night before, but he carried a message all the same. He was a young man, nervous and jumpy, his face pale with fear. He rode up to the edge of the clearing and stopped, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Silas Cooper," he called out, his voice a shaky tenor. Silas emerged from the cabin, the rifle now a constant companion in his hands. Nita stood behind him, a silent, powerful presence. "That's me," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. The young man took a deep breath. "I've got a message from Mr. Thaddeus Cain." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and held it out. "He says to give you this." Silas didn't move. He just looked at the man, his eyes steady and unblinking. "You can read it to me," he said. The young man's hands trembled as he unfolded the note. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Silas Cooper, your little stunt last night was a mistake. You've crossed a line. Your land is valuable, and I mean to have it. You have two choices. You can pack up and leave, and I will be generous enough to give you a small sum for your trouble. Or you can stay, and you will find out what it means to cross me. Your Indian friend won't be able to save you. Consider this your final warning. Thaddeus Cain." The young man finished reading and looked at Silas, his eyes full of a pleading terror. He wanted to be anywhere but there. Silas took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the young man's. "You tell Mr. Cain something for me," he said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "You tell him this land is not for sale. You tell him that I don't run. And you tell him that my Indian friend, as he calls her, is a warrior, and I am a soldier, and we are ready for him. Tell him to bring everything he has. Tell him we'll be waiting." The young man, visibly shaken, nodded. He shoved the crumpled note back into his pocket, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away as if the devil himself were on his tail. Silas and Nita watched him go, the dust from his horse settling slowly in the still air. The message had been clear, a direct threat. Cain wasn't just after the land anymore. He was after them. The fight was personal now. He had chosen to make them an example, a symbol of what happened to people who stood in his way. Nita walked over to Silas, her hand touching his arm. "He will come," she said, her voice calm, "and he will bring many men." "I know," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But he doesn't know this land like we do. He doesn't have the element of surprise. And he doesn't have you." She smiled, a small, fierce curve of her lips. "And he does not have you," she said. They spent the rest of the day making a plan. They had to be smart, to use the land to their advantage. They had to turn their home into a fortress and the surrounding wilderness into a weapon. The game was on. The stakes were life and death. And in the vast, indifferent landscape of the Old West, two people bound by an unlikely friendship were preparing to fight for their lives and their home. The final warning from Thaddeus Cain was the turning point. It transformed their defensive preparations into a full-blown war strategy. Silas and Nita, a soldier and a warrior, were a perfect team. He brought the knowledge of military tactics, of ambushes and defensive lines. She brought an intimate, intuitive understanding of the land, of its secrets and its rhythms. Their small cabin, once a simple dwelling, became the heart of their defense. They created a network of tunnels and covered positions, allowing them to move unseen. They stockpiled food and water, gathering what they could from the surrounding woods and river. Nita showed Silas how to build a series of small, concealed pits filled with sharp sticks, hidden under a layer of leaves and dirt. A simple but deadly trick. Silas, in turn, taught her the intricacies of flanking maneuvers, of drawing the enemy into a kill zone. He explained the importance of holding fire, of waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to make every shot count. They practiced, their movements silent and swift, their communication a series of gestures and glances. The forest became their training ground, the wind their accomplice, the trees their shield. The alliance with Cochise, while unspoken, was a constant source of comfort and strength. Nita had sent a message through a trusted scout, a silent signal that they were in danger. They knew that if things went bad, her father would come, but they also knew they couldn't count on it. They had to be prepared to fight this battle on their own. They spent the evenings by the fire, their conversation now a practical discussion of strategy. "They will come at us from the front," Nita said one night, tracing a line in the dirt with a stick. "They will think we are hiding in the cabin. They will surround it. We must be outside, waiting." "Exactly," Silas said. "We'll let them think they have us cornered. We'll pick off a few, make them nervous. Then we'll hit them from the side, from the high ground. Make them scatter." "They will be looking for a fight," Nita said, her voice calm and sure. "They will be angry. They will not be thinking. That is our advantage." "Greed makes men stupid," Silas agreed, "and Kane is a greedy man. He'll want a quick, clean victory. He won't be expecting a fight like this." The days bled into each other, a constant, low-level buzz of activity. They were a team, a single, unified force. The past, with all its trauma and regret, seemed to fade into the background. There was no time for it. There was only the present and the very real and present danger they faced. One evening, as the sun was setting, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn a brilliant shade of orange and purple. The silence was comfortable, a silent promise of solidarity. Nita spoke, her voice soft. "When I was a girl, my father would tell me stories of the great warriors. He would say that the greatest warriors were not the ones who fought the hardest, but the ones who fought for what they believed in." Silas looked at her. "What do you believe in?" he asked. "I believe in the earth," she said, her eyes on the horizon. "And I believe in my people, and I believe in a man who would risk his life for a stranger." He was humbled by her words. He had never thought of his actions as heroic. He had just done what felt right. But in her eyes it was a profound act of courage. "What do you believe in?" she asked him. Silas was silent for a long moment, the question a difficult one to answer. He had believed in his country once, and it had failed him. He had believed in peace, and it had been a lie. But now, as he looked at Nita, at the strength and quiet dignity in her face, he knew the answer. "I believe in this," he said, gesturing to the land, to the cabin, and to their shared, quiet space. "I believe in fighting for a life that is honest, and I believe in fighting for the people you care about." The words, so simple, were a profound admission. He had spent years running from life, from people, from his own heart. But now, in the face of a violent and unjust threat, he had finally found something worth fighting for. The first part of the battle was to prepare for the enemy. The second part, the most important part, was to remember what they were fighting for. The day of the attack was not a surprise. It came with the clear, crisp air of a mid-morning. The sun was high in the sky, casting long, stark shadows. They had known they were coming, but they didn't know when. The waiting had been the hardest part, a slow, agonizing grind on their nerves. Every sound, every movement was scrutinized. Nita, with her superior eyesight, spotted them first. She was on a high ridge overlooking the valley, her body a silent silhouette against the sky. She signaled to Silas with a prearranged gesture, a slow wave of her hand. 4 riders moving slowly, cautiously. They were not a large group, but their intentions were clear. They were not here to talk. Silas, hidden in a trench near the cabin, watched them through a small spyglass. They were well armed, their rifles gleaming in the sun. They were not just a few thugs, they were professionals. Kane had hired men who knew how to fight. He felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold, clinical calm of a soldier preparing for a battle. He was a Union veteran again, a man who knew how to survive. The men rode up to the edge of the clearing, their horses snorting and stamping. They stopped, their eyes scanning the landscape. They were looking for them, looking for a sign of movement. They were looking for a fight. One of the men dismounted, a tall, imposing figure with a dark beard. He was the leader, and he carried a sawed-off shotgun. He took a few steps forward, his voice a loud, booming call. "Cooper, we know you're in there. Don't be a fool. This is your last chance. Come out with your hands up." Silas and Nita didn't respond. They remained hidden, silent. The silence was a weapon, a psychological tool designed to unnerve the enemy. The man waited, his patience wearing thin. "All right, you stubborn bastard," he yelled. "Have it your way. We'll just burn you out." The men dismounted, their movements purposeful. They began to gather dry wood and grass, their intention clear. They were going to set the cabin on fire, forcing Silas and Nita out into the open. Silas watched, his hands on the rifle, his heart a steady, slow drumbeat against his ribs. He knew this was the moment. They were not just attacking them, they were attacking their home. Nita, on the ridge, had a perfect view of the scene. She watched the men, her mind calculating their every move. She saw the arrogance in their walk, the surety in their movements. They thought they had them cornered. They thought they had already won. She knew they were wrong. The man with the shotgun took a few steps towards the cabin, a lit torch in his hand. He was about to throw it. Silas took a deep breath, his finger on the trigger. He didn't want to kill, but he would. He had no other choice. Just as the man raised his arm, a sound shattered the quiet. Not the crack of a rifle, but a high-pitched piercing whistle, followed by the whizzing sound of a thrown object. It was Nita. She had thrown a small, sharp rock, a warning shot. It whizzed past the leader's head, missing him by inches, and struck a tree with a loud thud. The men froze, their bodies tensed. The sound had come from the high ground, from a place they hadn't even considered. They looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They had walked into a trap. Silas took his shot. He aimed not to kill, but to incapacitate. He fired at the leader's arm, the man's arm going limp as he dropped the torch. He screamed in pain, the sound a sharp human cry in the quiet. The other men scattered, their bravado gone, replaced by a primal terror. The hunt was on. The first shot was a catalyst. It transformed the static waiting game into a chaotic chase. The men, their surprise turned into panic, ran for cover. Silas and Nita, masters of the terrain, were ready for them. The men had entered their world, their domain, and they were about to find out just how dangerous that world could be. Silas, in his trench, remained hidden. He was the anchor, the steady, constant threat. He picked off a second man with a shot to the leg, the man's cry of pain echoing through the trees. The remaining two men, now running in fear, scrambled for their horses. Nita, from her high vantage point, was a ghost. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, her body a part of the forest. She had left her rifle on the ridge, opting for her bow and a quiver of arrows. The bow was silent, deadly, and a symbol of her people's ancient ways. She had been taught to hunt with it from the time she was a child. Now she was hunting men. She moved with an astonishing speed, her movements silent, a shadow flitting through the trees. The two remaining men, terrified and disoriented, ran blindly, their eyes fixed on the tree line. They didn't see her. They didn't see the snare she had set, a simple rope trap that was as old as the earth itself. The younger man, the one who had insulted her, ran headlong into it. He cried out as the rope caught his ankle, yanking him off his feet and leaving him dangling upside down from a tree branch. His face, contorted with fear and pain, was a mask of terror. The last man, the one who had carried the note, turned and saw him. He was a big, strong man, but his bravado was gone. He was a child lost in a forest. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting from side to side. And then he saw her. Nita, standing just a few feet away, an arrow knocked in her bow, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He dropped his rifle. "No, please, don't shoot. I just deliver messages. I didn't want to do this," he pleaded, his voice a frantic whisper. Nita held the bow steady. She looked at him, at the terror in his eyes, at the trembling of his hands. She saw not a man of evil, but a man of fear, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. She lowered her bow. "Go," she said, her voice low and steady. "Go back to your master. Tell him that the next time we will not be so merciful." The man didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his footsteps clumsy and loud, disappearing into the woods. Nita walked over to the man hanging upside down. He was struggling, his face purple with a mixture of fear and rage. She cut him down and he fell to the ground with a thud. "Go," she said, her voice flat. "Run, and tell your master what you saw." She left him there, a broken and humiliated man, and made her way back to the cabin. Silas was waiting for her. He had the two other men tied up, their wounds cleaned and bandaged. They were no longer a threat. They were just men, defeated and broken. Silas looked at Nita, at the quiet triumph in her eyes. "You didn't kill them," he said, stating a fact, not a question. "No," she said. "They are not warriors. They are cowards, and a coward's greatest punishment is fear. Let them go. Let them tell their master what they saw. It will be a more powerful weapon than any death." Silas nodded, a deep admiration in his eyes. She was right. The defeat, the humiliation, the terror of having a silent, unstoppable warrior hunting them in the woods would be a story that would spread far and wide. It would not just be a defeat. It would be a legend. They had won this battle, not with brute force, but with a masterful strategy and a profound understanding of their enemy's psyche. The first wave was gone, but they knew there would be more, and they knew they had to be ready. The war was far from over. It had just begun. The defeat of Kane's men was a powerful and public spectacle. The three men, bruised, beaten, and terrified, stumbled back into town. They didn't just tell their story, they broadcasted it. They spoke of a soldier and an Apache warrior who moved like ghosts in the woods, of traps that appeared out of nowhere, and of a woman who wielded a bow with a deadly precision that made their rifles feel like toys. They spoke of the quiet fury in her eyes and the cold, unblinking determination of the man who fought by her side. The story, in the retelling, grew into a legend. Silas Cooper, the reclusive Union veteran, was no longer a strange hermit. He was a guardian, a silent sentinel who was under the protection of Cochise himself. Nita, the daughter of a legendary chief, was no longer just an Indian woman. She was a spirit of the land, a fearsome and powerful warrior. The tale spread through the saloons, the trading posts, and the ranches like wildfire. The message was clear: stay away from Cooper's land. Thaddeus Kane, in his lavish office in the nearby town of Last Chance, was a study in fury. He had sent his best men, and they had been defeated not by a large force but by two people. The humiliation was a poison in his veins. The failure was a direct affront to his authority, to his reputation as a ruthless and successful man. He had underestimated them. He would not make that mistake again. He sent another messenger, but this time the message was not a warning. It was a taunt, a challenge. The note was delivered by a young boy who was too frightened to even look Silas in the eyes. It was scrawled on a piece of clean paper, a testament to Kane's arrogance. "Cooper, you won this round, but a game is not won in one move. You and your savage friend have a choice. You can stay and fight, and I will bring enough men to wipe you off the face of the earth, or you can leave. And you can leave her behind. I have a buyer for a strong, young Indian woman. Her life will be in your hands. Thaddeus Kane." The message was a direct attack, a personal and vicious blow. He was not just after the land anymore. He was after Nita. He wanted to break their alliance, to prove that he was stronger, that he could take what he wanted, and that nothing, not even the protection of a powerful chief, would stop him. Silas crumpled the note in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. He had not fought for a country to see a woman's life reduced to a commodity. He had not survived a war to see a friend become a pawn in a greedy man's game. He looked at Nita, who had read the note, her face a stone-like mask of quiet anger. "We will not run," he said, his voice a low growl. "I know," she said. "We will not run from a coward. He is afraid, he is angry, and angry men make mistakes." They knew what was to come. Kane would come with more men, with better weapons, with a plan to crush them. But they also knew that they had something he didn't. They had a home they were willing to die for. They had a friendship they were willing to protect at all costs. They were no longer a man and a woman from different worlds. They were a force, a unit. They were a symbol of a different kind of West, a West where friendship and honor were more powerful than greed and hatred. They were a legend in the making, a silent promise to all those who believed that the land could be shared, that peace could be made, and that a single act of kindness could change the world. The taunt from Thaddeus Kane was a declaration of war. He was not just coming for the land, he was coming for Nita. He had made it personal, and in doing so he had sealed his own fate. Silas and Nita knew they had to be ready. This was not a small skirmish, it was a battle. Kane would come with everything he had, a force large enough to overwhelm them. Silas sent a message to Cochise. It was a simple message delivered by a trusted Apache scout. "The white man comes for your daughter. He offers a price for her life. We will fight. We will not run. We will stand our ground." He had not asked for help. He had only given a statement of fact. He and Nita would face this alone. It was their fight, their home, their alliance. The waiting was the hardest part. The days were long, filled with the endless preparation for a battle that was sure to come. They built more traps, dug more trenches, and stockpiled more supplies. They practiced their maneuvers, their movements a silent, deadly dance in the woods. They were a perfect team, each one anticipating the other's moves, their trust a silent, unwavering bond. They also spoke more. Their conversations no longer just about survival. They spoke of their lives, their pasts, their fears, and their hopes. Silas told her about the horrors of the war, the moments that had shattered his faith in humanity. Nita listened, her dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing understanding. She, in turn, told him about her people, about their traditions, their stories, their spiritual connection to the land. She spoke of the struggles they faced, of the broken promises, of the slow, agonizing loss of their way of life. In these quiet moments, their friendship deepened. They were not just allies in a fight. They were friends, a brother and a sister in a world that had tried to tear them apart. They found a kind of peace in their shared understanding, a quiet strength that was more powerful than any weapon. The storm gathered on the horizon, not a storm of rain and wind, but a storm of men and horses. The news of Kane's plan had spread, and men from all over the territory, drawn by the promise of gold and the thrill of a fight, were joining his ranks. He was building an army, a force large enough to ensure a swift, brutal victory. He wanted to make an example of them, a message to any who would dare to stand in his way. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas looked at Nita. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I am afraid of what they will do to my people," she said finally. "I am afraid of what will happen if they win, but I am not afraid of them. I am not afraid to die for what is right." Her words were a stark reminder of the stakes. This was not just a fight for their lives. It was a fight for a principle, a fight for a way of life, a fight for the very soul of the land they called home. Silas looked at her, at the quiet dignity in her face. He had come here to escape, to hide from the world. But he had found something more important. He had found something worth fighting for, and he knew with a certainty that was as sure as the setting sun that he would not fail. He would not run. He would not surrender. He would fight for their home, for their friendship, and for a promise made in the heart of a storm. The day arrived with a cold, unforgiving sun. They saw them on the horizon, a cloud of dust rising in the distance, a dark stain against the clear blue sky. It was a large group, more than a dozen riders, well-armed and purposeful. Kane had not come alone. He had brought his army. Silas and Nita were in their positions, their bodies hidden in the long grass, their eyes fixed on the approaching force. The land, once a silent friend, was now a silent accomplice, a living part of their defense. They had planned for this. They had prepared for this. The waiting was over. The battle was about to begin. The riders rode into the clearing, their movements confident and arrogant. Thaddeus Kane was at the front, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He was a large man, his presence as menacing as his reputation. He was not just here to fight. He was here to win. Kane dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the silent, empty landscape. He looked at the cabin, at the small, defiant structure that stood in his way. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that broke the silence. "Cooper!" he yelled, his voice a booming roar. "Come out, you coward! Your time is up. I'm giving you one last chance. Give me the Indian woman, and this land can be yours." There was no response, just the silence of the land, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Kane's face hardened. He turned to his men. "Burn it down!" he commanded, his voice filled with a cold, lethal rage. 4 men dismounted, their movements purposeful. They carried torches, their flames dancing in the sun. They began to walk towards the cabin, their boots crushing the dry grass. They were confident, their faces a mixture of contempt and a brutal, professional calm. They thought they had won. They thought this was a simple, clean victory. They were wrong. Nita was in position, her body hidden in the tall grass. She was a silent, patient hunter. She waited until the men were just a few feet from the cabin, their focus fixed on the simple wooden structure. She rose, her body moving with a silent, fluid grace. She had her bow in her hand, the arrow nocked, the string pulled tight. Silas, in his trench, watched, his heart a steady, slow drumbeat. He waited, his finger on the trigger of his rifle. He had to be patient. He had to wait for the right moment. Nita's first shot was silent, a whisper in the wind. The arrow, a streak of wood and stone, flew through the air and hit one of the men in the shoulder. He cried out in surprise and pain, dropping his torch. The other men turned, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They looked for the source of the attack, their eyes searching the silent, empty landscape. They were looking for a large force. They were looking for a war party. They were not looking for a single woman with a bow. Silas took his shot. He aimed not to kill, but to maim. He hit a second man in the leg, the man's cry of pain a sharp, human sound in the quiet. The 2 remaining men panicked. They turned and ran, their bodies a blur of motion. The plan was working. They had used the land as a weapon, the silence as a psychological tool. They had turned the tables on their attackers. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. The battle was far from over, but the first wave had been defeated, and a powerful message had been sent. A message that was carried not by words, but by the quiet hum of a bowstring and the silent, deadly precision of a rifle. The storm had arrived, and they were ready for it. The defeat of the first wave was a shock to Kane and his men. The sight of their comrades falling to silent, unseen attackers sent a tremor of fear through their ranks. They had come expecting an easy victory, a simple show of force. They had found themselves in a ghost war, a battle against an enemy they could not see, a silent force that moved through the woods like a vengeful spirit. The men in the lead, who had been on foot, scrambled back to their horses, their movements clumsy and panicked. The man who had been hit in the shoulder with an arrow was screaming, the sound a sharp, high-pitched cry that unnerved the other men. The man who had been shot in the leg was on the ground, his face a mask of pain and terror. Kane, a cold fury in his eyes, watched the chaos. His face was a thundercloud of rage and humiliation. He had underestimated them. He had made a fatal mistake. He had brought men who were used to fighting men, but not a warrior who moved like a part of the earth itself, and a soldier who knew how to use the land as a weapon. "Get them out of here," he roared, his voice thick with a frustrated fury. "Get them back to camp. We'll come at them from all sides. We'll smoke them out." The men, their bravado gone, quickly mounted their horses and galloped away, carrying their wounded. The cloud of dust they had created on their arrival was now a testament to their panicked retreat. The silence that followed was a quiet, triumphant symphony. Silas and Nita, from their hidden positions, watched them go. They knew this was not a victory. It was a reprieve. Kane would be back, and he would be back with a vengeance. He had been humiliated, and a man like Kane would not rest until that humiliation had been avenged. They emerged from their hiding places, their faces grim but resolute. They went to the men who had been hit. The man with the arrow in his shoulder was still screaming, his face contorted in agony. The man with the gunshot wound in his leg was in shock, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Silas, with a grim professional calm, looked at Nita. "We can't just leave them," he said. Nita, with a quiet, efficient grace, went to work. She took out a small leather pouch filled with herbs and a knife. She looked at the man's wound, her eyes filled with a clinical, detached focus. "The arrow has to come out," she said. Silas nodded, his face a study in grim determination. He knew this. He had done it 100 times during the war. He knelt beside the man, his hands gentle as he held him down. The man screamed as Nita, with a quick, practiced movement, pushed the arrow through, a sharp, clean pain that was over in an instant. She then cleaned the wound, applied a poultice of herbs, and wrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth. They did the same for the other man, their movements a silent, synchronized ballet of care and efficiency. When they were finished, the men, defeated and broken, lay on the ground, their faces a mixture of pain and a dawning respect. They were no longer enemies. They were just men, and they had just been shown an act of mercy that was as surprising as it was profound. Silas looked at them, his gaze firm. "You tell Cain something for me," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You tell him we're not running, we're waiting, and you tell him that we are fighting not for gold or land, but for our lives, and that is a battle he cannot win." The men, their eyes filled with a kind of awe, nodded. They would tell their master. They would tell him everything. They would tell him not just of the ambush, but of the quiet, unexpected kindness of the two people he had so foolishly underestimated. The legend was growing, one act of defiance and one act of mercy at a time. The battle was not just being fought with bullets and arrows. It was being fought with courage, honor, and a single unyielding belief in the power of a good heart. They had won this battle, not with violence, but with a quiet, powerful display of strength and compassion. The days that followed the last confrontation were eerily quiet. The men Silas and Nita had released stumbled back to town, their faces a testament to their humiliation and fear. The story they told was a mix of fact and myth, but the message was the same. Silas Cooper's land was a death trap, and the man and the woman defending it were more than just people. They were a force of nature. This legend, however, only served to fuel Thaddeus Cain's rage. Humiliation for a man like him was a far worse punishment than defeat. He retreated to his private ranch, a fortress of his own making, and began to rally a larger, more ruthless group of men. He was not just looking for a win, he was looking for a massacre. Silas and Nita knew this. The silence was a lie. It was a holding of breath before the inevitable storm. They spent the time meticulously preparing, their movements a well-oiled machine of efficiency and trust. They fortified their positions, digging deeper, camouflaging their trenches with more care. They set more traps, not just to maim, but to confuse, to slow down and disorient a larger force. Nita, with her intimate knowledge of the land, discovered a hidden underground spring. It was a small but crucial detail that would ensure their survival in a prolonged siege. Silas, a soldier through and through, showed her how to calculate angles and trajectories, turning the surrounding hills into a network of potential sniper nests. The cabin itself became a stronghold. They barricaded the windows with thick planks of wood and filled old burlap sacks with dirt to build a small interior wall, a last line of defense. The air inside smelled of earth and old leather, a comforting scent that was a testament to their shared struggle. Their conversations, once a slow and cautious dance, were now filled with a quiet camaraderie. They were no longer two separate people. They were a unit, a single, unified purpose. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, they sat on the porch, a moment of shared quiet before the coming chaos. The silence was not empty. It was full of 1,000 unspoken things. Nita looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "My people believe that the earth has a heartbeat," she said, her voice a low murmur. "That if you listen, you can hear it. You have to be quiet, to be a part of the land, to understand it." Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I've always just seen it as something to survive," he said, his voice soft with a quiet reflection. "Something to fight against. The land, the weather, the animals, they were all just another enemy." "They are not your enemy," she countered, her voice gentle. "They are a part of you. The river that almost took me. It did not hate me. It was just strong. It was just being itself. You are a man who fights with a weapon. I am a woman who fights with the land. We are both just trying to be ourselves." Her words hung in the air, a profound truth that resonated deep within him. He had spent his entire life fighting, against the enemy in the war, against the wilderness, against his own demons. But Nita had shown him a different way, a way of living with, not against, the world. She had shown him that peace was not an absence of conflict, but a harmony with the world around you. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for his life or for his land. He was fighting for this new understanding, for the possibility of a different kind of life. He was fighting for her. The next morning, they saw the dust cloud. It was bigger this time, thicker, a dark, menacing stain against the horizon. It was not just a small group of men, it was an army. Cain had come, and he had brought every gun and every man he could buy. The calm was over. The firestorm was about to begin. The dust cloud grew with a terrifying speed, a relentless tide of fury and greed that blotted out the horizon. It was a physical manifestation of Thaddeus Cain's rage, a dark stain of 100 men and their mounts, all riding with a single purpose, to annihilate Silas and Nita. But Silas and Nita were not waiting in fear. They were in their positions, concealed in the heart of their carefully planned, labyrinthine network of trenches and hidden sniper nests. They had spent days preparing for this moment, meticulously mapping out every potential angle of attack. Their defense wasn't about firepower. It was about strategy, about turning their home into an inescapable fortress. They had the ultimate advantage: surprise, position, and a deep, intimate knowledge of the very land Cain sought to possess. Cain's men, a ragtag army of mercenaries and hired thugs, rode with a brash, arrogant confidence. They were not warriors forged in the heat of battle. They were just men with guns, blinded by a belief in their own overwhelming numbers. They were about to learn the difference between fighting and surviving. Thaddeus Cain was at the very front of the charge, mounted on a powerful black stallion, his face a mask of cold, triumphant fury. He was surrounded by his most trusted men, a small inner circle of ruthless killers who had done his dirty work for years. He had convinced himself this would be a simple show of force, a quick, brutal victory. He had no idea what was waiting for him, that his entire belief system, his reliance on brute force and intimidation, was about to be torn apart by two people who understood a different kind of war. He saw the clearing, the small, solitary cabin, and a sneer of victory played on his lips. Silas, in his sniper nest on a high ridge, had a clear shot of Cain. He could end this now with a single fatal pull of the trigger, but he held his fire. Killing Cain would only turn him into a martyr, a twisted hero in a villain's story. The target was not the man himself, but his confidence, his belief in his own invincibility. Cain had to be broken, humiliated, and made to understand on a fundamental level that he had chosen the wrong enemy. Nita, in her own hidden position, a small, barely visible hole in the ground covered with brush, had her bow and a quiver full of arrows. She was a silent, lethal ghost, a part of the earth itself, moving with a silent grace that the lumbering, arrogant men on horses could never comprehend. The men rode into the clearing, their movements a loud, clumsy, and arrogant display of force. They were not looking for an ambush. They were looking for a surrender, for a few terrified figures to emerge from the cabin with their hands in the air. Cain dismounted with a flourish, his voice a booming roar that echoed through the hills. "Cooper, you had your fun. Now it ends. Come out, you fool, and face your fate." The only answer was the silence, a silence so profound it was a weapon in and of itself, filled with 1,000 unspoken threats. Cain's face twisted in rage. He couldn't stand the lack of response. It was an affront to his pride. "Find them," he commanded, his voice cracking with a frustrated fury. "Burn everything. Tear this place to the ground." The men began to fan out, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They were looking for a fight, and they were about to get a lesson in true combat. Nita's first shot was not at a man. It was an act of psychological warfare. The arrow, a silent blur of motion, struck the horse of one of Cain's men with a sickening thud. The animal cried out in pain and bucked wildly, throwing its rider to the ground. The men, their formation broken, looked around in confusion and fear. The attack was not coming from the front, where they expected it. It was coming from everywhere. Silas took his shot. He aimed not at a man's heart, but at a water canteen on one of the rider's horses, the metal exploding in a shower of water and shrapnel. The men looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. This was not a fair fight. This was a systematic, brutal hunt. The chaos grew as men were falling, not to bullets, but to the intricate traps they had set. They were tripping over camouflaged tripwires, their legs getting caught in snares, their bodies falling into hidden pits. The men were screaming, their confident bravado replaced by a primal terror as they fought an enemy they could not see, an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Cain, in the middle of the chaos, was losing control. His army was running, his formation shattered. He pulled his revolver, firing wildly into the trees, his face a mask of pure rage and fear. He had come to a place he didn't understand, to fight an enemy that was a part of the land itself. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his brute force. He had underestimated them, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The final shot came from Silas, a clean, precise shot that hit Cain's horse in the leg. The animal screamed, its body collapsing, throwing Cain to the ground with a violent thud. He landed hard, his body bruised and broken, his face a mask of shock and pain. The remaining men, seeing their leader defeated, turned and fled, leaving him behind a broken and humiliated man. The silence that followed was a quiet, triumphant symphony. They had won. The battle was over. The firestorm had come, and it had been extinguished, not with brute force, but with a masterful strategy and a profound understanding of their enemy's mind. The land had been their ally, and they had been its faithful guardians. The sound of the retreating riders faded into the distance, their frantic hoofbeats a testament to their profound defeat. Left behind was a silence that was more profound than any noise. The field of battle was now a scene of utter ruin, not of death, but of broken pride and profound humiliation. Horses lay wounded, men were writhing in pain from Silas's shots and Nita's traps, and the air was thick with the lingering smell of gunpowder and the bitter stench of fear. It was a battlefield of a different kind, one that spoke not of bloodshed, but of a complete and total psychological victory. Silas and Nita emerged from their hiding spots, their faces grim but resolute. They were alive, and they had won. But the victory felt hollow. There was no cheer, no celebration. They were just two people, a soldier and a warrior, standing on a battlefield they had masterfully created, with a quiet sense of duty and purpose. Their movements were a testament to their shared purpose. They went to the men who had been injured, their hands gentle as they tended to their wounds. Nita, with her small pouch of herbs and her profound knowledge of the land, was a healer as much as she was a warrior. She cleaned the wounds and applied poultices, her movements precise and efficient, her face a mask of focused compassion. Silas, with his quiet, clinical knowledge of a medic, helped her, his hands steady as he tied the bandages. They were not just winning a battle, they were proving a point. They were showing these men who had come with violence and hatred in their hearts, that there was a different way, that a man and a woman from different worlds could stand together, and that a battle could be won not just with violence, but with a quiet, powerful display of strength, honor, and a profound human kindness. They had chosen to demonstrate that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to save. They had captured Thaddeus Cain. He was a broken man, his body bruised and his spirit shattered. He lay on the ground, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He had come with an army, with a plan for a swift, brutal victory, and he had been defeated by two people who were not even fighting on his terms. He had underestimated them, and in doing so he had lost everything that mattered to him, his reputation, his power, and his pride. Silas knelt beside him, his face a study in a cold, quiet fury. "You came here to take our home," he said, his voice a low growl filled with a controlled rage. "You came here to take a life. You came here with hate in your heart. You were defeated not by a large force, but by the land, and by us. We showed you a different kind of strength, a strength you didn't even know existed." Cain, his voice a weak, pathetic wheeze, looked at him with a mixture of terror and a dawning, bitter respect. "You should have killed me," he said. He understood the brutality of his own world, where mercy was a weakness. "Killing you would have been an easy victory," Silas said, his voice hard. "Living with this defeat, that will be your punishment. You will tell your story. You will tell everyone what happened here. You will tell them that you came with an army and you were defeated by 2 people. You will be a legend, a story of a coward who came to take what was not his and was sent away in shame. Your own name will be the first thing to haunt you." Nita, standing beside Silas, looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet, knowing pride. She saw the man he had become, a man who had chosen mercy over vengeance. He was no longer just a killer, a soldier who had seen the worst of humanity. In this moment he was a man of honor, a man who had chosen to rebuild his soul rather than destroy another's. He had not just won a battle, he had won a piece of his soul back. They released Cain and his men, leaving them with their horses and their defeat. The men, their heads hung low, rode away, their confidence and their arrogance gone. They were no longer a threat. They were just a story, a living testament to the 2 people who had stood their ground, who had fought not with violence but with courage, honor, and a quiet, unyielding belief in a different kind of world. The battle was over. The war was just beginning, but they had a feeling that they had already won. The seeds of peace had been planted in the very soil that had been chosen for war. The aftermath of the battle was a time of quiet reflection and profound change. The wounds, both physical and emotional, were tended to. The land, once a battlefield, was now a silent, peaceful canvas. The signs of the battle were slowly erased by the wind and the rain, as if the earth itself were healing from the violence. But the legend of the 2 people who had defeated an army with nothing but a rifle, a bow, and a deep understanding of the land would live on forever, a story that was already being whispered from town to town. Silas and Nita were no longer a soldier and a warrior. They were just 2 people, a man and a woman, standing on the land they had so valiantly defended. They spent the next few days in a quiet, profound peace. They worked side by side, their movements a silent, synchronized rhythm of care and respect. They rebuilt the fence, mended the cabin, and tended to their small garden. The work was hard, a testament to the life they were so carefully building, but it was a labor of love. Every nail hammered, every seed planted, was an act of defiance against the chaos they had so recently faced. The news of their victory spread like wildfire. The story of Thaddeus Kane's humiliating defeat at the hands of a Union veteran and an Apache warrior became a legend that transcended language and culture. People from all over the territory, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and respect, began to travel to their small, isolated cabin. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for the people who had shown them that a different way was possible. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, was now a magnet for those who yearned for peace. The first visitors were a small group of ranchers, men who had once been suspicious and wary of Silas. They came with gifts, a sack of corn, a few strips of cured meat, a bag of coffee. They didn't speak much, their faces a mixture of awe and humility. They just stood there, their hats in their hands, their eyes filled with a quiet, dawning respect. "We heard what happened," one of them said, his voice a low rumble. "We just wanted to say thanks for showing us that there's still some good left in the world." The next visitors were a group of Apache warriors sent by Cochise himself. They came not with an army, but with a message of peace and friendship. They spoke with Nita, their words a melodic flow of their native tongue, their faces alight with pride. They looked at Silas, their eyes filled with a deep, knowing respect. They saw not a white man, but a friend, a man who had defended one of their own, and in doing so had honored their people in a way no treaty or document ever could. The cabin, once a place of solitude, was now a beacon of hope. It was a place where different worlds met, where different people came together, and where a new kind of community was being built. The war was over. The real work was just beginning. The work of building a bridge between 2 worlds, of showing people that friendship and honor were more powerful than greed and hatred. One evening, as the sun set, Silas and Nita sat on the porch, watching the sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Nita looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet, knowing smile. "You found your peace," she said, her voice a soft whisper. She had seen him transform, from a man running from his past to a man building a future. Silas looked at her, at the woman who had brought him to this place, who had shown him a different way. He had come here to escape the world, to find a place where he could hide from his memories. But he had found something far more precious. He had found a new life, a new family, a new purpose. He had found something worth living for, and more importantly, something worth fighting for. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked with hers. "I didn't find it. I made it. With you." The words were simple, but they held the weight of their entire shared journey. The story of Silas Cooper and the Apache woman would live on forever, a legend that was not born of violence and hatred, but of a simple, profound act of a human kindness. It was a story that would be told for generations to come, a story of a man who rescued a woman from a river and found a home, a family, and a peace he never thought was possible. The truce between Silas and Thaddeus Kane, forced by the sheer weight of his defeat, was a fragile but undeniably real thing. Kane, in his profound and bitter humiliation, had no choice but to spread the word of his failure. It was his punishment. The story of his well-equipped army, routed by a lone Union veteran and an Apache warrior, was not just a tale, it was a legend that was rapidly reshaping the entire social landscape of the Old West. The very act of his telling of the story, twisted and self-serving as it might have been, only solidified the myth of Silas and Nita. Their names became a byword for a new kind of power, not one built on force or greed, but on courage and honor. In the wake of this new, unexpected reality, Cochise, the legendary chief of the Apache, made a momentous decision. He would come to Silas's cabin not as a warrior on a warpath, but as a leader seeking a lasting peace. The news of his coming spread far and wide, carried by messengers and whispered on the wind, causing a powerful mix of fear and hope among the scattered white settlers and the native tribes. For many, this was an unprecedented act, a powerful signal that the old ways of war and broken promises might be giving way to a new kind of world. It was a sign that the very fabric of their existence was shifting, a hopeful thread woven into a tapestry of fear and violence. The day of his arrival was a day of hushed anticipation. The air was thick with tension, a tangible mix of fear, hope, and an ancient, unspoken animosity that had defined their relationship for generations. It was a moment in time where every breath seemed to hold the weight of history. Cochise arrived with a small retinue of his most trusted warriors. Their faces were not painted for war, but for solemn ceremony, a sign of their peaceful intentions. They carried no weapons, only the symbolic tools of peace and respect. Silas stood on his porch, the same porch where he had stood against the storm, a lone figure in a world that had tried to swallow him whole. Nita stood at his side, her hand a silent, comforting presence on his arm. Her touch was a powerful reminder of the deep bond they shared, a bond that had defied the expectations of both their peoples. The moment was a powerful symbol, a meeting of two worlds on a small patch of land, a crossroads where history was being rewritten. Cochise, his presence as commanding as ever, dismounted and walked towards Silas. His footsteps were silent on the damp earth, a testament to his life lived in harmony with the land. His eyes, as deep and dark as a starless night, held a profound and knowing wisdom that seemed to see right into a man's soul. He looked not just at Silas, but through him, seeing the man behind the soldier, the quiet heart behind the weary eyes, the scars of a different kind of war. "You are the man who defended my daughter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was both gentle and firm. "You are the man who stood against a storm and did not break. You are a man of courage, a man who knows that true strength lies not in the sword, but in the heart." He saw in Silas a reflection of the same quiet dignity and unwavering resolve that defined his own people. Silas, humbled by the praise, just nodded. His words felt small in the face of such a powerful moment. "I did what was right," he said, a simple and honest truth that encapsulated the entire journey. "The right thing is often the hardest thing," Cochise said, a faint smile touching his lips. He understood the immense cost of standing for what was right, the loneliness of such a choice. He turned to Nita and spoke to her in their native tongue, a soft, melodic flow of words that were as old as the mountains themselves. She listened, her eyes filled with a deep and profound love for her father and a quiet pride in the man beside her. She explained to her father not just what Silas had done, but who he was. She painted a picture of a man who had been broken by war, but had found a new life, a new purpose, and a new family. When they were finished, Cochise turned back to Silas, his gaze steady and unwavering. "My daughter tells me you are a man of honor, that you are a man of peace. The white man who came to your land, he came with greed and hatred in his heart. But you fought with courage and a different kind of strength. You fought for a home, you fought for a friend. This is a powerful thing, a thing that my people will remember." He pulled a single eagle feather from his own headdress and held it out to Silas. It was a simple gesture, but its meaning was immense. "This is not a reward," he said. "It is a sign of respect. From this day forward, our lands are one. Our people are allies. You are a friend of the Apache people, and your land is our land. We will protect it, and we will protect you. Let the world know that peace is possible, and that a single act of kindness can change the course of history." The pact was sealed, not with a piece of paper, but with an act of profound trust and a deep, abiding respect that transcended language and culture. The two leaders, a Union veteran and an Apache chief, stood there, a silent testament to a new kind of world, a world where peace was made not with a treaty, but with a handshake, a look in the eye, and an act of a profound human kindness. The war was over. The nations were no longer at war. They were at peace. The moment was a powerful one, a quiet revolution in a world of loud and violent conflicts. The land, which had been a symbol of division, was now a symbol of unity. And in the heart of that unity, a new kind of life, a shared life, was about to begin. The arrival of Cochise and the formal pact he made with Silas changed everything. The cabin, which had once been a symbol of Silas's isolation, was now a bustling crossroads of two cultures. Apache warriors came and went, their movements silent and respectful, a constant, watchful presence that offered a powerful and unspoken layer of protection. They were no longer just observers, they were partners. They brought food, shared stories, and helped with the work on the land. In return, Silas offered them a place of rest, and Nita, with her profound understanding of both worlds, became a translator of not just words, but of cultures. The white settlers, who had once viewed Silas with suspicion and Nita with a quiet racial animosity, now saw him with a quiet, dawning respect. He was no longer just the hermit. He was the man who had brought a fragile and yet powerful peace to the valley. The fear that had once defined their relationship with the Apache was slowly being replaced by a cautious and then a profound respect. The days settled into a new, quiet rhythm. Silas and Nita continued to work the land, their movements a silent, synchronized dance of trust and cooperation. She taught him more of her language, not just the words for the land and the animals, but the words for feelings and for a different way of seeing the world. She taught him about the sacredness of the earth, about the wisdom of the elders, and about the deep spiritual connection her people had to every living thing. He, in turn, showed her his world, the world of books and stories, of music and of a different kind of life. He taught her how to read and watched with a quiet pride as she devoured every book he had, her mind expanding with a powerful curiosity. They were two different people from two different worlds, but they were bound by a shared past, a shared struggle, and a shared hope for the future. Their lives, once so separate, were now inextricably intertwined. Their relationship was not a romance, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was a friendship forged in the fires of a life-and-death struggle, a bond that had been tested and had not broken. It was a kinship of soul, a silent, unwavering bond that was more powerful than any passion. They were a family of two, a brother and a sister, in a world that had tried to tear them apart. They had found in each other a solace and a strength they had never known, a quiet, abiding love that was more powerful than any words could express. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of colors, they sat on the porch, watching the land they had so valiantly defended. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and the sweet smell of the coming rain. Silas looked at Nita, at the quiet, serene beauty of her face, and felt a profound sense of peace he had never known. "What will happen now?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur, not of fear, but of a quiet, dawning curiosity about the future. She smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet, knowing wisdom that had been forged in the heart of a storm. "We will live," she said. "We will be a story that is told around the fire, a story that is passed down from generation to generation, a story of a man who saved a woman and a woman who saved a man, a story of two people who built a home in a world that tried to burn it down, a story of peace, of love and of a shared life. We will be a living legend, a testament to the power of a good heart." Her words were a simple truth, a profound and beautiful promise. They were no longer just living. They were a living, breathing testament to the power of a good heart, to the strength of a true friendship, and to the possibility of a different kind of world. They had found their peace, not by running away from the world, but by standing their ground and fighting for it. Their story was not just their own. It was a story of a new kind of world, a world where the lines between enemies and friends were blurred, and where humanity was the most powerful and profound weapon of all. The story of Silas Cooper and the Apache woman would live on forever. A legend that was not born of violence and hatred, but of a simple, profound act of a human kindness. It was a story that would be told for generations to come, a story of a man who rescued a woman from a river and found a home, a family, and a peace he never thought was possible. It was a story that would remind people that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that a single act of courage can change the course of history forever. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of their alliance. The valley, once a place of conflict and fear, was now a model of peaceful coexistence. The white settlers and the Apache people, once sworn enemies, now lived side by side, their shared respect for Silas and Nita a constant reminder of the bridge that had been built between them. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, was now a beacon of hope for a different kind of life, a life where honor and friendship were more powerful than greed and hatred. It was a place where stories were shared, where cultures were celebrated, and where a new kind of community was forged. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its natural beauty no longer marred by the specter of conflict. Silas, no longer a hermit, was a revered figure in the community. He was a man of quiet wisdom, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to believe in the best. He was a pillar of his new community, a silent, strong presence who had shown them all a different way. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man who, with a single act of kindness, had changed the world around him. He taught the young people how to hunt and fish, how to respect the land, and how to live with honor and integrity. He had found a new purpose, a new reason to live, and a new family to love. Nita, too, was a legend. She was a living bridge between her people and the white settlers, a diplomat who spoke both languages, both in word and in spirit. She was a woman of strength and grace, a warrior who had fought for peace and a peacemaker who had fought with the strength of a warrior. She was a living, breathing symbol of the new world that had been forged on that small, isolated patch of land. She taught the children of both nations the songs and stories of her people, the wisdom of the elders, and the deep spiritual connection to the earth. She was not just a leader. She was a teacher, a healer, and a powerful force for good. Together they raised a small family, not of their own blood, but of a shared love and a profound human kindness. They took in an orphaned boy from the town, a lost child who had no one to care for him, and they took in a young Apache girl, a child who had lost her family in a skirmish a few years before. They raised them both as their own, teaching them both languages, both cultures, both ways of life. The two children, a white boy and an Apache girl, grew up together, a living, breathing testament to the love that had been born in the heart of a storm. They were a beautiful mix of two worlds, a powerful symbol of the new world that was possible. Years passed. The children grew up, their lives a beautiful tapestry woven from the threads of two different cultures. The world changed. The Old West was no longer a place of wild, untamed chaos, but a place of towns and farms, of laws, and of a fragile but real peace. But the legend of Silas and Nita remained. It was a story that was told around campfires and in trading posts, a story of a man and a woman who, with a single act of kindness, had changed the world. It was a story of a battle won, not with violence and hatred, but with courage, honor, and a profound human connection. It was a story that would be passed down from generation to generation, a timeless tale of love, friendship, and the enduring power of a good heart. In their final years, Silas and Nita would sit on their porch, their hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the mountains. The land was still beautiful. The river still flowed, its waters a constant, gentle reminder of the storm that had brought them together. The world was still full of its own conflicts and its own storms, but they had found their peace. They had built their home. They had created a legacy that would live on for generations to come. A legacy of peace, a legacy of friendship, a legacy of a shared, quiet life. They had not just survived, they had lived. And in a world filled with chaos and conflict, that was the most powerful and profound victory of all. Their story would not just be a tale of the Old West, it would be a testament to the universal truth that a single act of kindness can change the world forever.